The four basic tissue types, just working from top to bottom of this slide. Nervous tissue does a lot of communication in your body, sending messages and commands and signals and things. Your brain and nerves and so forth are classic examples of nervous tissue. If you want to move something in your body, or if you want to move your body or a part of it, sort of macroscopically speaking or externally, you're going to want muscle tissue for that. And there's different kinds of muscle that do different jobs at different places that we'll discuss. Epithelial tissue form boundaries and surfaces and so forth. So the epidermis part of the visible part of your skin is the most obvious epithelium, but the lining of things like your stomach or your lungs or your bladder or things are also a form of epithelial tissues, and it sort of forms the boundary between us and something else, often the rest of the universe. Connective tissues, as the name implies, do connect one thing to another, but they also provide support and protection and other things. There's a whole host of different types of connective tissues that we'll talk about. These tissues arise, as all tissues arrive, from the developing embryo. We begin life as one cell, a fertilized egg called a zygote, but that begins to divide into more cells, which divide into more cells, and so on. And eventually those cells begin to differentiate. They begin to change their form in order to take on particular jobs. And early on in embryonic development, these cells begin to divide and come into groups, and you can discern within this developing embryo 3 layers of distinct cells that have distinctly different fates. One of those layers is called the ectoderm, coded blue in this slide, and eventually some of the cells in the ectoderm will become the various parts of your skin and integumentary system, and other ones are called the neural crest, will eventually become the nervous system, stuff like your brain and so forth. There's a kind of layer in the middle of that developing part of the embryo called the mesoderm, and it will form things like muscle and bones and other connective tissues. And then the last layer is the endoderm, and that forms mucous membranes like the lining of much of your digestive tract or your lungs and things like that. And then it'll also, some of those cells in the endoderm will form glands, things like your pancreas that create certain secretions and hormones and other things like that. That's really all I want to say about embryonic development for this chapter, though. So all tissues, we're going to talk about tissue differences, and you'll definitely get into the difference in tissue structure in lab and so forth. But things in our body have certain similarities, and it's always good to talk about what's the same in addition to what's different. And so all tissues, regardless of what type, have cells in them, and cells are alive. They're the functional unit of life, and so there's some cells in every tissue, and that often defines what the tissue will be. There is often some non-living stuff around the cells, often that the cells make, or the cells maintain, or they alter, or they live inside of, or something like that, called the extracellular matrix, or ECM for short. And most cells are sort of, hanging out in this extracellular matrix. They actually need that extracellular matrix. And like I said, they actually make it or maintain it or modify it or things like that. We'll get more into the extracellular matrix and connective tissues, where it plays a really big role in their behavior. But the extracellular matrix is generally made of some kind of proteins and then some other stuff, which might include other molecules like proteoglycans or glycosaminoglycans or other things that have lots of very complicated names with many syllables. All tissues also have some kind of liquid inside them called the interstitial or extracellular fluid. That's the fluid that sort of hydrates the tissue. It's sort of found, inside the extracellular matrix. And exactly what kind of cells you have, what kind of matrix you have, and how much of each you have. Some tissues have lots of cells, some actually have pretty few cells and are mostly matrix. But exactly what kind of cells you have, what kind of matrix you have, and how much you have of each is what's going to give tissues such different behaviors, even though they all have the cells with the same genetic information and so forth and so on. Other things that all or at least most tissues have are things joining those cells together. Most tissues, though we might learn about one or two exceptions, have cells that are in contact with each other or with the surrounding matrix, which is some sort of solid-ish, gel-ish sort of thing there. And so those cells must have junctions. Those cells have things that sort of hold them in place and hold them together and hold the tissues